So today, we're going to dive into an idea that might just change the way you look at the world. We're talking about the invisible forces that make violence seem normal, or maybe even right. We'll be digging into the work of sociologist Johan Galtung and his powerful concept of cultural violence.
Okay, so when you hear the word violence, what pops into your head? For most of us, it's something physical, right? A punch, a battle, an explosion. It's something you can see, something tangible, and something that's pretty easy to point at and say, that's wrong. This is our starting point. But here's the question that's at the heart of everything we're talking about today. What if the most powerful, most dangerous kind of violence is completely invisible? What if it's working in the background, making all those visible acts possible in the first place?
To really get our heads around this, let's start with the part we can all see. Think of it like the tip of a giant iceberg. This is what we all recognize as violence without a second thought. Galtung gives this a name: direct violence. It's pretty much any physical act that harms a person's basic needs. We're talking their survival, their well-being, their freedom, or even their sense of who they are.
Now, the most important thing to remember here is that direct violence is an event. It happens at a specific moment in time. It has a clear beginning and an end. It's kind of like an earthquake, a sudden, destructive thing that we can all point to and say, that happened. But just like with an iceberg, what's underneath that visible tip is so much bigger. Beneath the event, there's a deeper, more constant kind of harm, one that's literally built right into the fabric of society.
Galtung calls this structural violence. And this is where it gets tricky. See, with this, there's no single person pulling a trigger. Instead, the social structure itself, our economic systems, our political systems, is what's actually causing the harm. It's that unequal distribution of resources and power that creates so much suffering.
And unlike the sudden event of direct violence, structural violence is a process. It's this continuous, slow, constant grinding of tectonic plates. It's not a single action, but for millions of people, it's just everyday reality.
This table here shows exactly how Galtung breaks it down. For example, just look at that top row for survival. Direct violence is killing. Pretty clear. But structural violence is exploitation that leads to death, maybe from starvation or a disease that could have been prevented. You see, the outcome is the same, but the cause is completely different. One is an act, the other is the system itself.
Okay, so this brings us to the real core of the idea. If direct violence is the earthquake and structural violence is the constant shifting of the tectonic plates, then what's the fault line itself? What is that deep, underlying condition that makes the whole thing possible?
This, Galtung says, is cultural violence. You can find it everywhere, in our religions, our ideologies, our art, our language, even in our science. It's any part of our culture that makes direct and structural violence seem normal, acceptable, or even righteous. It's basically the cultural software that's running the hardware of harm.
So let's put it all together. If direct violence is an event and structural violence is a process, then cultural violence is a permanence. It is the fault line, that deep, stable feature of a culture that might lie dormant for years, but ultimately makes those destructive quakes inevitable.
Galtung's own words just capture the power of this so perfectly. It works by changing the moral color of an act from red for wrong to green for right, or sometimes just by making the violence so gray and opaque that we don't even recognize it as violence at all.
And these three types of violence, they're all locked together in this nasty self-reinforcing cycle. A culture teaches that one group is better than another, which then justifies an unjust system. And when people try to challenge that system, direct violence erupts to keep it in place, which only reinforces the original cultural belief. See how it works?
The best way to visualize all this is as a triangle. Direct violence is that visible peak at the top, but it's totally supported by the other two corners, the systemic inequality and the cultural stories that justify it all. You can't just try to solve one corner without addressing the other two.
Okay, so that's the theory, but how does this actually work in practice? Let's look at some really concrete examples that Galtung gives us to see how these cultural justifications actually get built.
One of the main tools in the toolbox is creating this huge divide between a self and an other. It's about framing one group as chosen, civilized, or superior, and then defining the other group as the complete opposite. This simple us versus them binary, well, that's the seed from which cultural violence grows.
Galtung argues that, historically,
The idea of a god choosing one specific group has been an incredibly powerful source of cultural violence. When one group is seen as divinely chosen, it can be used to justify sexism, nationalism, or racism, framing these systems not as unfair, but as part of a natural or even divine order.
And here is the terrifying destination that this process leads to. Once the other is no longer seen as a person, but as an it, like an animal, a disease, or just an object, then any act of violence against them becomes possible. It can even be seen as a duty.
You know, this is such a subtle but really profound point. Even the language we use can be a form of cultural violence. Galtung points out how we use these sanitized words, like discrimination, to describe life-destroying structural violence, or prejudice for these deep cultural justifications for harm. The language itself hides the brutal reality of what's happening.
So, if we're all caught in this vicious triangle, it sounds pretty bleak, right? Is there a way out? Is there any alternative? Well, Galtung says yes, there is, and he points us towards something he calls a culture of peace.
He actually finds the answer in Gandhian philosophy, which is built on two incredibly powerful core principles. First is the unity of life, which just completely rejects any division between self and other and sees the value in everyone. And second is the unity of means and ends, which basically says you can't use violence to create peace. The way you get to your destination has to match the destination itself.
And what this creates is a virtuous triangle. A culture of peace, based on empathy, helps build structural peace, with systems that are fair and just. And those two things together, they foster direct peace, acts of friendship, cooperation, and understanding. And just like the violence triangle, this one is also self-reinforcing, but, in a good way.
And this leaves us with one last big question that turns the lens right back on ourselves. Because Galtung's framework isn't just for looking at history, it's a tool for right now. What accepted ideas or norms in our world today are quietly justifying harm? What might future generations look back on and point to as our cultural violence? Something to think about.